Derbyshire, September 1815. The dinner had been arranged for 24 guests, which was the precise number the long dining room at Montfort Hall could seat, without appearing either crowded or spare. And Suren had spent 3 days preparing every detail. She had consulted the cook on each course. She had confirmed the table arrangement with the housekeeper. She had selected the wines from the cellar inventory she had memorized during her first month at Montfort, because no one else in the household had thought to organize it. And the previous system, if it could be called a system, had consisted of the butler retrieving whichever bottles happened to be nearest the door. The evening was proceeding well. The venison had arrived at the correct temperature. The conversation was circulating with the ease of people who had been fed properly and seated next to the right partners. Lady Ashmore, who was difficult about fish, had been given the beef. Sir Neville Cobb, who talked excessively about his horses, had been placed beside Colonel Ferris, who was partially deaf in his left ear, and had been positioned so that the deaf ear faced Sir Neville directly. This had been Suren's arrangement. No one had noticed it. This was the nature of the work she did at Montfort. It was invisible when it was done well, and attributed to the household when it was done at all. The Duke of Montfort sat at the head of the table in the high-backed chair that had belonged to 4 generations of Ashcroft men, and he occupied it with the stillness of a man who considered his presence the organizing principle of any room. Dacre Ashcroft did not shout. He did not need to. He had the authority of a title so old it required no assertion, and a face so composed that displeasure could be communicated in the angle of a jaw, the temperature of a pause, the precise number of seconds he allowed to pass before responding to something his wife had said. Suren was speaking. She had been answering a question from Mrs. Halstead about the restoration of the East Wing, which Suren had overseen since April, and which had involved the replacement of the roof timbers and the replastering of the long gallery and the coordination of 4 tradesmen who had never previously been coordinated by anyone. Dacre set down his glass. The sound was small. It should not have carried. It carried. Mrs. Ashcroft, he said, and the name landed with the weight of a correction rather than an address. I believe Mrs. Halstead was asking about the house, not the accounts. The table adjusted. It was not a dramatic adjustment. No one gasped. No one froze. 24 people performed the simultaneous social recalibration of guests who have understood that something has happened and have decided, collectively and instantly, to pretend it has not. Forks were lifted. Conversations resumed. But the quality of the room had changed in the way a room changes when the host has made visible, in front of witnesses, the precise location of a boundary. Suren looked at her husband across the length of the table. She held his gaze for exactly long enough to register that she had heard him, and then she turned back to Mrs. Halstead and said, with the modulated warmth of a woman who had learned to smile through a wound without letting the wound show, "The East Wing is looking very well. I think you will find the gallery much improved." Mrs. Halstead agreed that she would, and the dinner continued, and the venison was cleared, and the syllabub was served, and nothing further was said, and everything further had been communicated. After the guests had gone, Suren stood in the entrance hall and watched the last of the carriages move down the drive in the September dark. She thought about the word accounts and the way it had been delivered, not as a reference to numbers, but as a category. The category of things a duchess should not be seen to understand. The category of usefulness that was appropriate for a steward, but unseemly in a wife. She considered the 23 people who had heard it, and the one person who had said it, and the careful way the room had reorganized itself around his correction. And she understood, with the clarity she brought to inventories and estimates and everything she had been trained to quantify, that the correction had not been about Mrs. Halstead's question at all. It had been a demonstration, a public recalibration of her position, performed with such economy that no one would call it cruelty, and everyone would remember it as authority. She stood there until the last carriage lamp disappeared beyond the Montfort gates. Then she walked through the darkened house to the private study she had claimed on the second floor, the room Dacre still referred to as the sewing room, though she had never sewn anything in it. And she sat at the desk, where she managed the correspondence and the household accounts and the estate repairs that no one acknowledged she managed. And she opened the ledger, and she continued the work that kept Montfort Hall standing, because the work did not stop when the humiliation did. And she had learned that particular lesson in her first week as the Duchess of Montfort. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about Dacre in March. The marriage had been settled in the spring of 1814, which was to say it had been negotiated, because settled implied an agreement between two willing parties, and willing was a word that required some qualification in the case of Sir Lydgate and the 6th Duke of Montfort. The Lydgate fortune was Lancashire cotton, 3 mills in Burnley, 2 in Colne, a warehouse operation in Liverpool, and the accumulated judgment of 3 generations of men who understood production and margin and the particular mathematics of turning raw material into money. Harland Lydgate, Serene's father, had inherited the first 2 mills and built the 3rd himself, and had raised his only daughter in the offices and the counting rooms and the loud mechanical rhythm of the factory floor, because he had no sons, and because he believed that knowledge was not gendered, and that ignorance was expensive regardless of who wore it. Serene had grown up reading contracts before she read novels. She could calculate a quarterly return before she could dance a quadrille. And when she finally learned the quadrille, she learned it with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, which meant she danced it correctly and without passion, which was, her mother had observed, perfectly adequate for Lancashire and entirely insufficient for London. London was where the Ashcroft solicitors had found her, not found precisely, identified. The Montfort estate was in difficulty of the kind that old families encountered when the land stopped earning what the title demanded. Dacre's father had renovated the West Wing. Dacre's grandfather had purchased the London house. Dacre himself had maintained both at full operation while the estate income declined by 1/3 over 6 years, because reducing the visible apparatus of a dukedom was, in his understanding, indistinguishable from reducing the dukedom itself. He needed money. Serene had money. The arithmetic was not complicated. What was complicated was the question of what Serene would become once the arithmetic was complete. The marriage contract specified her dowry and the settlement terms with the precision of a commercial agreement, because it was a commercial agreement. What the contract did not specify, because no contract could, was the quality of the life she would live inside it. No clause addressed the question of whether she would be consulted on household decisions or permitted to review the accounts her fortune was sustaining, or spoken to at breakfast as though she were a person rather than a provision. She did not expect love. She expected respect, which she defined as the recognition that her competence was an asset rather than an embarrassment. She expected partnership, which she defined as the acknowledgement that a woman who brought £40,000 to a marriage was not a guest in the house it purchased. She received neither. Dacre had married her in June at the chapel on the Montfort grounds, with the efficient formality of a man completing a necessary transaction. She was staying in the house her fortune had secured, wearing the title his family had provided, and the distance between those two facts was the landscape of her marriage, and it was colder than she had prepared for. Her father had walked her down the chapel aisle and had held her arm with the grip of a man who suspected he was making a mistake, and had decided to trust his daughter's judgment over his own instinct. He had kissed her forehead at the altar and said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "You know where I am." She had not gone to where he was. She had not written to him about the distance, or the courtesy, or the way Dacre spoke to her in the mornings, with the polished indifference of a man reviewing correspondence he did not consider urgent. Telling her father would have been an admission that she had miscalculated, and Seren Lydgate did not miscalculate. She revised. She adjusted. She found the accurate number eventually, and the accurate number of this marriage, the one she had arrived at by September, was that Dacre did not see her as a wife. He saw her as a transaction that had been completed and filed. The pattern had established itself within the first month and had hardened into routine by the third, the way all patterns do when no one interrupts them. Dacre took his breakfast in the dining room at 8. Seren was not expected to join him, and on the 2 occasions she had appeared at the table in July, he had looked at her with the polite surprise of a man finding someone in a room he considered private, and had continued reading his correspondence without adjusting the silence to include her. By August, she took her breakfast in the morning room, which was smaller and faced east and had better light, and she told herself this was preference rather than exile, and she almost believed it for the first week. The household reported to Dacre. This was the convention of the house, and the way things had been done since his mother's death 8 years earlier. Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, brought the daily domestic report to the Duke's study at 9. Waverley, the butler, confirmed the evening arrangements with the Duke at 4. Seren received none of these reports. She received instead the edited aftermath, the decisions already made, delivered to her by Mrs. Pemberton with the respectful efficiency of a woman informing a guest what had been arranged on her behalf. Serene had attempted, in July, to insert herself into the household operation directly. She had spoken to Mrs. Pemberton about the linen inventory, which was disorganized, and about the kitchen stores, which were being purchased at prices she recognized immediately as 15% above the market rate, because she was her father's daughter, and she could read a supply cost the way other women read a novel. Mrs. Pemberton had listened with the attentive stillness of a woman receiving instructions she did not intend to follow, and had said, "I shall raise the matter with His Grace," and the matter had not been raised. Or if it had been resolved without Seren's involvement, which amounted to the same thing. She had gone to Dacre directly after that. She had stood in his study on a Wednesday afternoon in the last week of July, with the linen inventory in one hand and the kitchen accounts in the other, and had said, "The household is overspending by approximately £300 per quarter. The kitchen purchasing is being done through a single supplier at above market rates, and I would like your permission to address it." He had looked at the papers. He had looked at her. He had said, with the measured courtesy that was worse than coldness because it performed respect while withholding it entirely, "I appreciate your attention to these matters, Mrs. Ashcroft. I will have Waverley review them." Mrs. Ashcroft, not Serene, not your Grace. The formal address of a man speaking to someone whose name he had decided carried a specific weight, and that weight was less than the butler's. Waverley had reviewed them. Waverley had changed nothing. And Serene understood that the rejection was not about the accounts. It was about the fact that she had walked into his study with evidence and competence and the expectation that both would be received as contributions rather than intrusions. And he had seen not a partner, but a boundary violation. She had taken the papers from his desk and walked back to the morning room and sat in the chair by the east window, and sat in the chair by the east window, and considered designated places and the men who assigned them. Her mind went to her father's counting room in Burnley, where she had sat on a high stool at 12 years old and learned to read a balance sheet, and where no one had ever suggested that her understanding of the numbers was an intrusion. She thought about the fact that her £40,000 had purchased this marriage and could not authorize a change in the kitchen supplier. She began, quietly and without announcement, tracking every expenditure in the Montfort household in a private ledger she stored in the sewing room, in the desk that was hers because no one else wanted it. recording the numbers with the methodical patience of a woman who understood that evidence, accumulated in sufficient quantity, eventually became unanswerable. She did not know yet what she was building the case for. She knew only that the case was getting larger by the week, and that when the moment arrived, the numbers would be ready. Lady Orla Vane arrived at Montford Hall on the second Tuesday of October, unannounced and unhurried. She was the widow of Sir Aldrich Vane, who had been Dacre's godfather, and she had known the Ashcroft household since before Dacre could walk. She treated Montford with the proprietary familiarity of a woman who had once rearranged the drawing-room furniture without asking permission and had never been challenged on it. She was 61. She had survived one husband, 2 London seasons that had nearly killed her socially, and the complete collapse of the Vane estate in Shropshire, which she had rebuilt herself over 7 years through methods that polite society preferred not to examine closely, and that impolite society acknowledged were brilliant. She wore gray, she carried a walking stick she did not need, and she arrived at Montford with the energy of a woman who had heard something that interested her and intended to see it for herself. Seren was in the morning room when Lady Orla was shown in. She rose with the automatic composure of a woman receiving an unexpected guest in a house that was technically hers and practically not. Lady Orla looked at her. She looked at the east-facing window and the writing desk positioned to catch the light, and the household ledger open with entries in a hand she did not recognize as the butler's or the steward's. She absorbed all of this in the time it took to cross the threshold, because Lady Orla Vane had been reading rooms for 40 years, and this room told her a very specific story. "You are working," Lady Orla said. She did not frame it as a question. "I am reviewing the household accounts," Seren said. Lady Orla sat without being invited, which was her way, and looked at Seren with the direct gaze she reserved for truth and had no time for social performance. "Where is Dacre?" she said. "In the study, with Mr. Waverley. And the household accounts are here," Lady Orla said, "in the morning room, with you, rather than in the study. With him." Seren met her gaze. She said nothing. "He does not know you are keeping these," Lady Orla said, gesturing toward the ledger. "No," Seren said. "He does not know." "Good," Lady Orla said. "Keep it that way. Numbers collected without interference are the only numbers worth having." She paused. "How bad is it?" Seren understood that the question was not about the accounts. "I am managing," Seren said. Lady Orla looked at her for a long moment. "I did not ask if you were managing. Managing is what competent women do when the situation is bad and no one is helping. I asked how bad it is." Seren held her gaze. She measured the distance between what she could say to this woman and what she was ready to say to anyone. "It is not what I expected," Seren said. Lady Orla rose from the chair with deliberate energy, a woman who had received enough information and intended to act on it in her own time. She had not asked for details. She had not pressed for the specific incidents. She had read the room, the ledger, the desk by the east window, and the composed stillness of the woman sitting behind it, and she had drawn her conclusions with the efficiency of someone who trusted her own assessment and did not require additional testimony. "It never is," she said. "But you are keeping the numbers. That is the part that matters. The rest of it, the morning room and the breakfast, and the way he speaks to you when there are witnesses." She paused at the door. "That is his accounting, not yours. Do not confuse the two." She left the morning room and went to find Dacre in the study, and Seren sat at the desk with the ledger open and thought about the distinction Lady Orla had drawn, his accounting and hers, and about the fact that for the first time since June, someone in this house had looked at her ledger and had not seen an intrusion. She had seen evidence. The crisis arrived in November. The rain began on a Monday and continued without interruption for 9 days. The river that ran along the eastern boundary of the Montfort estate exceeded its banks on the 6th day and revealed, with the brutal clarity that water brings to neglected infrastructure, that the eastern drainage channels had not been maintained since Dacre's father's time. 3 tenant farms were flooded. The East Road was impassable. 14 families were displaced from their cottages into the outbuildings of the home farm, and the damage to the winter stores was the kind that meant hardship through the spring if it was not addressed immediately. Dacre was in London. He had gone on the Thursday before the rain began, for business that Seren understood, from the correspondence she had seen on his desk, involved a meeting with his solicitors about the mortgage on the London house, a matter he had not discussed with her and which she had learned about from the accounts she was not supposed to be keeping. The steward, Mr. Aldwin, stood in the entrance hall on the 7th morning of the rain, with water on his boots and exhaustion in his face, and delivered his report to the space where the Duke would normally stand, and found instead the Duchess, already dressed for the weather, awake since 5. "I'm aware of the East Cottages," Seren said before he could begin. "I walked the boundary at first light. The water has reached the Fenwick farm and the Coulter holding. How many families are at the home farm?" 14, Your Grace. Possibly 15 by this afternoon if the lower road goes." "The lower road will go," Seren said. "The culvert beneath it has not been cleared since last spring. I noted it in August." Mr. Aldwin looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something he had not realized needed recalibrating. "Open the estate reserve account," she said. Mr. Aldwin began to say something about the Duke's authorization. Seren held up one hand. "I am authorizing it," she said. £40 for immediate relief. Blankets, food, fuel for the outbuildings. Send to the village for Dr. Eames. Hire every available man for the drainage clearance beginning tomorrow morning. I want the East Channel opened before the next rain, which, based on the sky, will be Friday." She paused. "I will put everything in writing, every expenditure, every decision. When the Duke returns, he will have a complete accounting. If he objects to any of it, the objection will be to the record, not to the memory. And the record will be accurate." Mr. Aldwin was a man who had served Montfort for 22 years, through 2 dukes. He had never received instructions from a duchess. He understood, in the way that competent men recognize competent authority, regardless of where they expected it to come from, that the instructions were correct. "Yes, Your Grace," he said. Seren spent the next 6 days managing the crisis. She was in the East Field at dawn. She was in the outbuildings at midday checking supplies. She was at the drainage channel in the afternoon, overseeing the clearance work. Standing in the mud in boots she had borrowed from the groundskeeper, giving instructions to men who discovered, in the practical democracy of a crisis, that her directions were specific and effective and delivered without hesitation. She wrote to her father on the 4th day for advice on the drainage engineering, because Harland Lydgate had managed water problems at the Colne Mill for 15 years. His reply arrived by express on the 6th day, with a diagram and 3 sentences of technical guidance, and a 4th sentence that said, "You are doing exactly right. Trust the numbers." She also wrote another letter that week, a longer one addressed to an office in London, whose name she had found in a government circular 6 months earlier, describing the drainage failure and its causes and the remedial measures she had undertaken, with measurements and costs and observations about the pattern of deferred maintenance across estates in the county. She sent this letter from the village post office rather than through the Montfort household post, and she filed the copy in the sewing room desk in a folder she had not labeled. Dacre returned from London on a Saturday, 10 days after the rain had begun, and 4 days after Seren had completed the emergency repairs. He found the East Cottages drained. He found the families returned. He found an accounting of every expenditure, £47 and 6 shillings, written in his wife's hand and placed on his desk. He said nothing about it to her that day. He said nothing the following day. On the third day, he said to Mr. Aldwin, in a conversation Seren was not present for, but that Mr. Aldwin relayed to her afterward, "The drainage work appears to have been handled competently." Competently. The word arrived in the morning room like a stone dropped into still water. Not gratitude, not acknowledgement. The minimum possible concession, delivered to the steward rather than to her, stripped of her name and her effort, and the 6 days she had spent in the mud while he was in London, discussing the mortgage on the house her money was paying for. Seren received the word and thanked Mr. Aldwin, and waited until he had left, and then sat very still, in the chair by the east window, and sat in the chair by the east window, turning over the word, competently, and the letter she had sent from the village post office, and the folder in the sewing room that she had not labeled. She thought, the numbers are getting larger. She thought, good. The winter assembly at Bratherton House was the first large gathering after the November rains, and Lady Ashmore had organized it with the determined hospitality of a woman who believed the county deserved an occasion and intended to provide one. 46 guests, a supper, dancing, the full apparatus of a Derbyshire social evening. Seren attended with Dacre, which was the convention, and separated from him within 15 minutes of entering the room, which had become the practiced choreography of their public appearances. She talked with Mrs. Halstead about the tenant relief efforts. She talked with Colonel Ferris about the county road conditions. She talked with Bess Aldwin, the steward's wife, who had sought Seren out specifically to say, with quiet directness, that the families in the East Cottages had asked her to convey their thanks to the Duchess for what she had done during the flooding. Seren received this and considered 14 families who had sent their gratitude through a steward's wife, because they understood, as everyone appeared to understand, that gratitude sent directly to the Duchess would somehow not arrive at its destination. The families knew. The staff knew. The county knew. The only person who did not appear to know, or who knew and had decided it was the correct arrangement, was the Duke himself. The Duke was across the room, in conversation with Lord Stannard and Sir Neville Cobb, and a man Seren did not recognize, a thick-shouldered gentleman in an expensive coat, who laughed frequently and carried himself as though rooms existed to organize around him. She would learn later that this was Lord Alistair Drummond, a baronet from the neighboring county, who had attached himself to Dacre because he understood that proximity to a duke was a form of currency. She was standing near the tall windows when Lord Drummond appeared at her side. He had crossed the room with deliberate trajectory, and she understood from the way he positioned himself, angled slightly toward the room rather than toward her, that the introduction was not private. It was a performance, and the audience was already assembling. "Your Grace," he said, with the broad smile of a man who believed his charm was a public service. "I have been hearing a great deal about the Duchess of Montfort, the flooding business, quite the campaign." "Thank you," she said. "The tenants were in need of immediate assistance." "Immediate assistance," he repeated, with the inflection of a man tasting a phrase and finding it amusing. He looked at the group within hearing range. "Yes, I heard you were out in the fields yourself, directing the men, managing the drainage." He paused with the timing of a man who had been making these pauses for decades. One does wonder whether the Duke was aware he had hired such a capable foreman. The word landed the way it was designed to land. Foreman. Not Duchess. Not wife. The word of a man who had taken the story of her competence and turned it into evidence of something inappropriate, something overreaching, something that a woman in her position should not have been doing, because her position, in Lord Drummond's accounting, did not include anything that mattered. 3 people smiled. 2 looked away. Mrs. Halstead went very still. Seren looked at Lord Drummond, with the composure she had been building since she was 16. The composure of a woman who had stood in Manchester boardrooms and heard this precise variety of diminishment from men who believed that confidence and a loud coat were the same thing as authority. She was formulating her response. She had several available, organized in her mind with precision, graded by severity, calibrated to context, ready for deployment. She did not get the chance to deploy any of them, because at that moment, she saw Dacre. He was 10 feet away. He had heard everything. She could see in the set of his jaw that he had understood exactly what Lord Drummond had meant, and that he was standing in the Bratherton assembly room with a choice in front of him as legible as a surveyor's map. He could say nothing. He could let the word stand. He could allow the room to absorb Foreman into the general understanding of his wife's position, which was not so different from the understanding he himself had been constructing since June. Or he could do something else. Seren watched him. The room watched him. Lord Drummond, who had not yet registered the Duke's proximity, was still smiling at his own remark. She saw Dacre's jaw change. She saw something move behind his eyes. Not the composed authority. Not the measured courtesy. Something less controlled. Something that looked like recognition. Not of her. Recognition of what Lord Drummond's word actually meant. That Foreman, spoken about his wife in a public room, was not an insult invented by a stranger. It was a mirror held up to the position he himself had built, and hearing it in another man's mouth had shown him the thing he had not been able to see from the inside. She thought, "He is seeing it." She thought, "I do not know yet what he will do with it." Dacre stepped forward. The room recalibrated. The Duke of Montfort said, in a voice that carried without being raised, because 200 years of Derbyshire were in it, and every person in that room understood exactly what 200 years sounded like, the Duchess of Montfort managed a crisis that had been neglected for a decade. She organized the relief of 14 displaced families. She directed the repair of drainage infrastructure that had failed under 3 successive administrations of the estate, including mine. He looked at Lord Drummond with the full, unblinking attention of a man who had decided that the next sentence mattered. "If the word you are reaching for is Foreman," he said, "I would suggest that the word you need is the one you already used when you arrived. Your Grace." The room went still. The genuine stillness of 46 people understanding that something had shifted in the structure of the evening, and in the structure of something larger than the evening. Boo. Lord Drummond said something about intending no disrespect. The words were the correct words in the incorrect order, delivered with the diminished energy of a man in retreat, and Seren watched him withdraw with the measured attention she brought to all important information. She looked at Dacre. He was not looking at her. He had returned to his previous conversation, and nothing about his manner suggested he had just done something that would be discussed at every dinner table in the county for the next month. But she had seen his face in the moment before he spoke. She had seen the recognition. He had heard his own silence in another man's mouth and had not been able to tolerate the sound of it. She did not know yet whether the recognition would survive the morning. She did not know whether the man who had said "Your Grace" in this room would return to competently in the study. She thought, "I will wait. I have been waiting since June. I can wait to see whether this is a revision or a performance." The answer arrived 3 days later, though not from Dacre. It arrived by courier on a Tuesday morning, in the form of a sealed document carried by a man in the livery of the Crown Office, who dismounted at the Montfort gates and asked for the Duchess of Montfort by name, not by her husband's title, not as an appendage to the Duke's correspondence, by her name, independently, as a person of separate and specific consequence. Waverley received the courier in the entrance hall and found himself, for the first time in 20 years of service, uncertain about protocol. The document bore a royal seal. It was addressed to Her Grace Serene Ashcroft, Duchess of Montfort. He brought it to the morning room. Serene took the document from the silver tray and looked at the seal and felt the weight of it and understood, before she broke the wax, that the folder in the sewing room had arrived somewhere she had not anticipated. She opened it. The document was from the office of the Lord President of the Board of Agriculture, acting under the authority of the Prince Regent. It was a formal commission. It appointed Serene Ashcroft, Duchess of Montfort, to serve as a corresponding advisor to the board's inquiry into rural drainage and tenant welfare in the central counties of England. It cited her detailed reports on infrastructure failure and remedial practice. It cited specific passages from her letters, the letters she had sent from the village post office, the ones she had written from the sewing room desk while the household operated around her as though she were a guest in her own home. The language was administrative, but the meaning was not. The Crown, through its appointed officers, had read her work, had found it sufficient, had found it more than sufficient, had found it valuable enough to formalize into a commission bearing the royal seal, the kind of document that arrived at the houses of men who managed great estates and sat in Parliament and whose names appeared in the county records going back generations. And it had arrived at her desk, in the morning room, addressed to her. She read it twice. She sat very still with the document in her hands, and she thought about the village post office and the drainage measurements and the observations she had written in the quiet hours after the household had stopped pretending to include her. She did not cry. She had stopped crying about Dacre in March, but she sat for a long time before she moved. And when she moved, she did not take the commission to the study. She placed it on the desk in the morning room, beside the household ledger, in plain sight. And she went out to the south field to check the drainage channels, because the drainage channels were her work, and the commission had confirmed it. And she was not going to rearrange her day for the pleasure of delivering a revelation. Dacre would find it, or the county would tell him before the week was out. The royal seal was not a private document. It was a public fact. And public facts, unlike private competence, were very difficult to file away without acknowledgement. She walked the drainage channels in the November cold, and she thought about her father's counting room and the high stool she had sat on at 12 years old, and the way no one in that room had ever questioned whether she belonged there. She thought, I have been building a case. She thought, the case has just been heard by a higher court. The household learned about the commission before Dacre did, which was the natural consequence of a royal courier arriving in crown livery and asking for the Duchess by name in front of 3 footmen and the hall boy. Information of this kind moved through a house like Montfort with the speed and efficiency of water finding its level. Mrs. Pemberton heard it from Waverley. The cook heard it from Mrs. Pemberton. And by the time the servants sat down to dinner at noon, the fact of the royal seal and the Duchess's name had been absorbed into the collective understanding of the staff with the quiet, seismic quality of information that changes the weight of things. Mr. Aldwyn heard it from Waverley directly, because Waverley understood that the steward needed to know before the Duke, and because Waverley, who had spent 20 years maintaining the hierarchy of Montfort Hall without questioning it, had found himself, since the flooding, in possession of a question he had not previously considered, whether the hierarchy he maintained was the correct one. Dacre learned about the commission at 4 that afternoon from Mr. Aldwyn, who delivered the information with the careful neutrality of a man reporting a fact he understood would be received as something considerably more. A commission, Dacre said, from the Board of Agriculture, Your Grace, under the authority of the Prince Regent, addressed to the Duchess, by name. The silence that followed was the kind, Mr. Aldwyn had learned to read over 22 years, the kind that meant the Duke was processing something that did not fit inside the existing structure of his understanding and was having to build new structure to accommodate it. On what subject? Dacre said. Rural drainage and tenant welfare. The commission cites reports Her Grace submitted over recent months. Detailed reports. Regarding infrastructure failure on estates in the county, including this one. Dacre looked at the window. He looked at the south field, where the drainage channels ran clean in the November light. The field where his wife had spent 6 days in the mud while he was in London. Where are these reports? Dacre said. I believe Her Grace maintains records in her private study, the morning room, and the room on the 2nd floor. The sewing room, Dacre said. Mr. Aldwin said nothing. The designation hung in the air with a weight it had not previously carried. Dacre did not go to the south field. He did not go to the morning room. He went to the 2nd floor, to the room he had called the sewing room for 5 months, and he opened the door and he saw the desk. The desk was covered in paper. Correspondence, drainage surveys, tenant records, cost analyses, quarterly projections for the estate more detailed and more accurate than anything his steward had ever produced, written in his wife's hand. He opened the drawer. He found the household ledger, tracking every expenditure since July. He found the kitchen accounts, the supplier analysis with the 15% overpayment, circled in red ink and annotated with 3 alternative suppliers and their comparative pricing, the same analysis she had brought to his study in July, and he had handed to Waverley with the polished dismissal he had mistaken for delegation. He found a section labeled Deferred Maintenance that ran to 4 pages. 4 pages of work that should have been done and had not been done, documented with dates and estimated costs and projected consequences, including a note from August about the East Road culvert that read, "If not cleared before the autumn rains, the lower road will fail." She had known. She had written it down. She had filed it in a room he called the sewing room, and the autumn rains had come, and the road had failed exactly as she had predicted, and she had fixed it while he was in London. He found the unlabeled folder. He read the copies of the letters she had sent to the Board of Agriculture. 5 letters over 4 months, each one describing the condition of drainage and tenant welfare in Derbyshire, with a specificity that made his own understanding of his estate look like a sketch beside a survey. He read them all. He stood in the room he had designated for her, in the room she had turned into an office that operated more effectively than his own, and he read every document she had produced in 5 months of being treated as a guest in the house her fortune had purchased. He put the letters back. He closed the drawer. He stood in the room for a long time. Then he went downstairs and sat at his desk and did something he had not done in 5 months of marriage. He took a sheet of paper and wrote her name at the top. Not Mrs. Ashcroft, not the Duchess. Serene. He stared at it for a long time. Then he set the pen down because he understood that what needed to happen next could not be done on paper. It required him to stand in front of the woman he had married and diminished and say something that could not be redirected or delivered through a steward. And he was not yet certain he knew what the something was. He only knew it was overdue by 5 months, and that the royal seal had not created the debt. It had only made the debt impossible to ignore. He found her the following morning, in the entrance hall at 7, pulling on the borrowed boots. She looked up when she heard him on the stairs. He was dressed for the outdoors, which was unusual at 7, wearing the coat he wore for estate work rather than the one he wore for the study. "Good morning," she said. "Good morning," he said. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and looked at her with an expression she had not catalogued. Something unfurnished. Something that looked like a man standing in a room without the structure he usually brought to rooms. "May I walk with you?" he said. She thought about the 5 months of breakfasts taken alone, the morning room, the sewing room, the word competently delivered to a steward, the venison dinner, and the 24 guests who had watched him correct her. She thought about the assembly, the word Your Grace, spoken in her defense, spoken in a voice that carried 200 years. Yes, she said. You may walk with me. They walked to the south field in silence for a quarter mile. The November morning was cold and clear, everything sharp-edged and visible, the breath of two people walking side by side, visible in the air between them. He went first. I went to your study yesterday, he said, the one on the second floor. The sewing room, she said. She said it without inflection. She wanted him to hear the name. He was quiet for 3 steps. It is not a sewing room, he said. No, she said. It is not. I read the letters, he said. The ones you sent to the board, and the ledger, and the kitchen accounts, and the supplier analysis from July. The one you gave to Waverly, she said. Yes, he said. The one I gave to Waverly. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He turned to face her, and she saw the unfurnished thing in his expression, and understood what it was. A man who had opened a drawer and found inside it the complete detailed record of his own failure, written in the hand of the woman he had failed. She waited. She was not going to help him. She had spent 5 months helping this household without being asked. She wasn't going to help him apologize. I have been wrong about you since before we married, he said. I decided what you were before I met you. I married the fortune, and I housed the family, and I did not once consider that the person who carried both was someone I had not troubled to see. The November wind moved across the field between them. The dinner in September, he said. The word accounts. I said it to diminish you. I said it because you were being seen as someone who understood the workings of this estate, and I experienced that visibility as a correction of my own position rather than a credit to yours. That is not an excuse. It is the mechanism. I want you to know that I understand the mechanism. The mechanism has been operating since June, she said. Yes, he said. It has. The morning room, she said. The breakfast. The reports that go to your study instead of to me. The sewing room. The way you say Mrs. Ashcroft, as though the name is a leash. He flinched. She saw it. She did not regret causing it. She had 5 months of precision stored, and she was going to spend it now. Not in anger, not in tears, but in the specific, unassailable language of someone presenting the account. I brought you the kitchen analysis in July, she said. It would have saved £300 per year. You gave it to Waverly. Waverly changed nothing. I fixed the drainage while you were in London, negotiating a mortgage on the house my dowry paid for. You told your steward it was handled competently, a word you would use for a tradesman whose invoice you were approving. She held his gaze. I have been keeping the numbers, she said. Every number. Every expenditure. Every decision made without me, and every decision made despite me. And I sent the record to the only institution willing to receive it. He said, I did not know about the letters. No, she said. You did not know about the letters because you did not know about the desk, because you did not know about the room, because you decided in June that I belonged in the morning room and the sewing room and the carriage and the far end of the dining table. And you never once walked through any of those doors to see what I was doing inside them. She paused. The Crown walked through the door, she said. You did not. He stood very still. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. He said it again. I'm sorry, Serene. Her name. Not Mrs. Ashcroft. Her name. Spoken in the South Field in November, standing beside the drainage channel she had built. I do not need your apology, she said. I need your revision. Not a word. A change. I need the reports to come to me. I need the household to report to me. I need the study door open when decisions are being made about the estate my money is sustaining. and I need you to say my name in that house the way you just said it in this field." "Can you do that?" she said. He looked at the field. He looked at the drainage channel. He looked at the woman standing in borrowed boots in the November cold, who had rebuilt his estate and earned a royal commission and kept a ledger of his failures with the patience of a woman who understood that evidence, accumulated in sufficient quantity, eventually became unanswerable. "Yes," he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. She read him the way she read numbers, looking for the error, looking for the gap between the stated figure and the actual one. She found no gap. "Then we will see," she said. She turned and walked along the drainage channel, continuing her inspection, because the work did not stop for apologies, any more than it stopped for humiliation. He stood in the field and watched her walk. And then he followed. He did not walk beside her. He walked behind her, along the channel she had built, and she heard his footsteps behind her in the frost, and she did not slow down, and he did not ask her to. The revision began the following week, and it began, as all genuine revisions do, not with a declaration, but with a change in the infrastructure. The household reports came to Seren. Mrs. Pemberton brought the domestic report to the morning room at 9. Waverley confirmed the evening arrangements at 4. The kitchen supplier was replaced within the fortnight. Seren presented the analysis to Dacre in the study, standing where she had stood in July with the same papers, and this time he read every page and said, "This will save considerably. £312 per year," she said. "I calculated it in July." He did not say anything further about July. He did not need to. The number said it for him. The commission required her to correspond with 3 other estates and to prepare a detailed report for submission in the spring. She conducted this work from the second-floor study, which Dacre had stopped calling the sewing room, and which the household had begun referring to, with the gradual linguistic adjustment that follows a change in power as Her Grace's study. Lady Orla returned in December. She arrived with the same unannounced energy as before, and found Seren at the desk with the commission documents and a letter from the Board of Agriculture requesting her attendance at a meeting in London in January. Lady Orla looked at the desk. She looked at the commission. She looked at Seren. "The numbers," she said. "The numbers," Seren confirmed. "And the Duke," Lady Orla said. "He is revising," Seren said. "Is the revision sufficient?" Seren considered the question honestly. She weighed the reports, and the kitchen supplier, and the study door that was now open when decisions were being made. She recalled the breakfast table, where Dacre had appeared on a Thursday morning in the second week of the revision, and had sat down across from her without explanation, and had poured his own tea and read his correspondence in her presence, and had said, after 20 minutes of shared silence, "The Eastfield rotation needs discussion. Would you review it this afternoon?" She thought about the way he had said, "Would you rather than I? We'll have Waverley." "It is becoming sufficient," Seren said. "He is not a man who revises quickly, but he revises thoroughly, and he does not reverse what he has changed." Lady Orla nodded. She accepted the tea and drank it with the satisfaction of a woman who had understood the situation in October and was content to watch it reach the conclusion she had predicted. "He will be a better man for it," Lady Orla said. "Some men require a royal seal to see what is standing in front of them. The important thing is not the delay. The important thing is what they do after the seeing." Seren looked at the commission on her desk. She turned over what Lady Orla had said in October, his accounting and hers, and about the fact that the 2 accounts were beginning, slowly and with the friction that attended any genuine change, to converge. She remembered the entrance hall in September, watching the carriages leave in the dark. She remembered the woman who had stood there with the word "accounts" ringing in the silence and had walked upstairs to the sewing room and opened the ledger and continued the work. She looked at the woman sitting at this desk now, with a royal commission and an open study door, and a husband who had followed her along a drainage channel without asking her to slow down. They were the same woman. The work had not changed. What had changed was the room she was permitted to do it in, and the number of people required to acknowledge that the work was hers. She picked up her pen. She returned to the commission report. Lady Orla finished her tea and left quietly, having received everything she came for. The December light moved across the desk, and the south field was visible through the window, and the drainage channels ran clean, and the household operated around her, not as though she were a guest, but as though she were what the Crown had recognized and what Dacre was learning, with the slow thoroughness of a man who revised completely once he began, that she had always been. She heard his footstep in the corridor at 4:30. He appeared in the doorway of the morning room, not the study, the morning room where she worked, and he stood there for a moment with the quarterly accounts in his hand and an expression that had more of November's field in it than October's study. "May I sit?" he said. She looked at him. She looked at the chair across from her desk, the one Lady Orla had occupied twice now, the one that had never been offered to the Duke because the Duke had never come to the morning room to work, only to deliver corrections. She nodded. He sat. He opened the quarterly accounts. He began to read. She returned to the commission report, and for 20 minutes, the morning room held 2 people working in the same silence, the kind of silence that was not indifference, and was not performance, and was not the cold absence she had grown accustomed to, but something new, something that had the quality of a man learning to be in a room with a woman he was only now beginning to see. She did not comment on it. She was not going to narrate his progress, but she noticed it, and she filed it in the private accounting she had kept since June, in the column that had been empty until November and was now, entry by entry, beginning to fill. The woman who kept the numbers, the woman who did the work, the woman who had brought £40,000 and a counting room education and the patience to wait for a house to recognize what her father's house had never questioned. Suren Ashcroft, Duchess of Montford. She had been told to know her place. She had found it herself in a morning room and a sewing room and a south field in November, in a ledger and a letter and a royal seal. And the place, it turned out, was considerably larger than anyone in this house had estimated, except her.